I'm James Gardner, host of Your History, Your Story, a podcast for everybody who loves stories about interesting people and events told by those who uncovered them from within their own family trees. This, we hope, will inspire you to discover and celebrate your history and your story. In this episode of Your History, Your Story, our guest is Lisa Voelker, author of the recently released award-winning novel, The Spoon, the story of two families' survival of the Hungarian Revolution. The Spoon is based on stories told to Lisa by people whose lives were hugely impacted by the events surrounding the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, which lasted only 12 days before it was crushed by Soviet tanks and troops, resulting in thousands of deaths and hundreds of thousands of people being exiled from their homeland. Lisa's love of history was nurtured early in her life by her mother, and she's always enjoyed researching and telling stories, particularly ones that relate to people who've overcome great odds or have endured significant difficulties. The Spoon is one of those stories. I'd now like to welcome Lisa Voelker to our show. Welcome, Lisa.
Well, thank you, James. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, you bet. So we're going to be talking about your book, The Spoon. But before we talk about your book, we're going to talk about you. Is that okay?
Well, I guess it is. We'll find out. How deep are you going to delve?
Well, it's your history, your story. So we're going to talk about your history and then
right.
how it leads into this incredible book that you've written. So you and I have spoken before, and I know that you have a love of history that you've had since you were quite young. And there's some people who were instrumental in fostering that love of history. Could you tell us about your earliest interaction with your love of history?
The earliest I recall, I was 5 years old. My mother had been widowed at the age of 27. She was a Navy widow, and she was left with 3 children. And she had some big decisions to make. And one of them ended up being a kept promise. You know, people of that era, people born in the 30s, growing up through the Depression, through World War II, they tended to be people who were pragmatic. And so my father and mother had a discussion very early on, because they were only married for 2 years when he passed away. So very early on, they had a discussion where he had picked out his plot out at Fort Rosecrans in San Diego. And he also asked my mother that if the worst should happen, because there was a very high mortality rate for pilots, test pilots during the 50s, very high. And so if the worst should happen, if her life allowed, that we spend time with his parents. And they lived in New England. And they're an old family through my paternal grandmother. And so the family was firmly entrenched back there. And they had a big old house. And my mother decided to go back to school. And we would live with our paternal grandparents, my 2 siblings and my mother and myself. And they would take care of us, which, you know, was mostly the grandmother, my Nana. So she's so dear to my heart. And we lived with them for a year and a half while my mother got her master's degree from URI. And it was a magical experience. That first summer when we arrived, one of the first experiences I had, other than traveling across the United States, because my mother could not pass a historical marker. And if she accidentally did, we backed up on the highway to take the exit. So we visited all these state and national parks across the country, countless museums, ending up in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, which is in itself a very historical place. And the very first memory I have through all that experience was when my mother took me to the home of Helen Keller. And afterwards, in the small bookstore where you would buy your ticket to go through the house, my mother bought me the biography of Helen Keller. And I read that at 5 years old, and I was hooked. People's biographies, what people had lived through, the courage, you know, the heroism, the stories of just people. And in spending that summer and the next year there, I know I said year and a half afterwards because it was the beginning of June through August of the following year. I met so many relatives of an elderly age who had stories of World War II, stories of growing up in this very iconic, very patriarchal, very historical area, the most historic area that our modern culture has here in the United States. The immigration story, the revolution story. I mean, it was just, it was so at hand, it was so touchable. And I was all in. At 5 years old, I was all in.
That's wonderful. You mentioned about having elderly relatives,
Mhm.
and what a prize it is
Yes.
to have relatives like that. And I'll tell you, when an older person finds a young person who wants to know, who wants to listen, it is the most enjoyable. Now that I'm I'm one of those
Yes.
elderly relatives, I feel
Both of us.
like when one of my grandsons or granddaughter asks a question about even my parents or something historical, I'm like, well, let me tell you. It's so much fun, but both parties benefit from it.
Well, I agree totally. I have to say that many people who know me know that about me. And so when they ask me a question, sometimes they will follow it with the short answer, please.
Reader's Digest.
Exactly. Exactly.
Wow, wow. So Lisa, then as you got older, what was your educational background?
Well, I grew up in a wonderful, amazing village, now a little town called La Jolla, California, very arts and sciences oriented. And it was also a military town. There were lots of Navy retirees there. We were right there in the middle of San Diego, well, the northern end of San Diego. And we were, I would say, fairly inundated between our education and movies and just the general culture of San Diego at the time. There was a lot of post-World War II influence still in that we were surrounded by all these people. Our street was about maybe 70% military retirees, and there were all these stories floating around. So there was that aspect of, as I was growing older, I was, impacted by that. I liked nothing better than on a Friday evening to turn, for those of us who know what to turn the channels means.
Yeah, those things.
Yeah, we had stations 2 through 13, although there wasn't anything on channel 9. So I would turn the dial. Usually it was channel 8 or 10, sometimes 12 in San Diego that would have a movie on Friday night. And I would turn the dial looking for the black and white movies, the old movies that were usually based, during the Depression or World War II stories. And it was, again, it was just more stories of how people endured. It was just so uplifting. I was so impressed by these stories.
This is a life education, and you don't even have to pay a tuition for it.
Really, it really was. And I had
Yeah.
relatives who had been World War II veterans. Both my mother and my father were New Englanders. And after that first year and a half spent back east, I would correspond with a few of them. I was writing letters at the age of 6. I just loved communicating with these people because, a phone call then was expensive. And so you had to hurry up and say all you had to say in 3 minutes and hang up.
When I was in college, Thursday night, I called home
Yes,
and I would call collect. We would talk for about 15 minutes and then we would wrap it up, and that'd
yes.
be it for a week.
Exactly. I did the same thing. I went to Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, which was also momentous in my history journey. But I would call my mother and she would let the phone ring. If it only rang 3 times, then that was me and she needed to call me back.
I know we did that too. So, Lisa, when we spoke earlier, you mentioned that when you were quite young, you took a really big interest in researching and writing about your family history. Can you tell us about that?
Exactly. So that beloved family, my father's mother and father, my grandfather was the first to pass away and then my Nana while I was in college. I was 17. And I took a term off and went back to New England, to Woonsocket, staying with a wonderful man who would become as close to a father as I ever had, having never known my father. And going through this amazing old 250-year-old home, walking through all those rooms had been so dear to me growing up, because we spent most of our summers there. It was just like every other summer we went back, and it was just so wonderful, I can't tell you. In walking through those rooms, and then in starting to take the house apart, there were two events that transpired. One was I had this awakening, because most children, the mirror's right in front of their face, and they don't see the bigger picture. And at that moment, while I was standing there in the house with nobody else there, standing in the library where my Nana had sat, and considering this space, this magical space of all these oak and glass bookcases filled with just wonderful volumes of American authors, and all leather bound and gilt edged. And it was just, and I realized it was all gone. It was all gone. It was there just momentarily, and it was going to be gone forever. And it was such a tragedy. And I realized that if I didn't find out everything I could right now before this was all taken apart, there would never be an opportunity to regain it. And so I started going through that house with a fine-tooth comb. And the next incident was finding a scrap of paper, which was truly amazing considering my Nana. Everything, she was old school New England, and everything was just so. But here was a torn slip of paper, not a full sheet of paper, just this torn piece of paper. And on it, she had written in her very precise, small, beautiful handwriting about 8 direct generations leading up to her. I went upstairs to the attic, which had totally terrorized me as a child. My room was where I laid in bed. If I looked to the right, I looked through the door across the playroom to the tall, narrow door that led up through a spiral staircase to the attic. And I was certain there were monsters in there.
Of course there were.
Exactly. So I just pulled up my courage as much as I could and opened that door and went up into the attic with no one else in the house. I was 17. It's like, I can do this, And I went up there and I found a suitcase, and I went back down to the first floor and started just at the back end of the house and just started going through the entire house. And anything I found, any other scrap of paper, anything, any old photograph, anything in any drawer that had any bit of information, I threw into that suitcase. And that was the beginning of what was to become a book I wrote called Generations Before Us. And this was at a time preceding the internet. So I gathered all this information by stomping through old cemeteries and graveyards and talking to every old relative I could. Next door to my grandparents were sandwiched between my grandmother's childhood home and her brother's home. And around the corner was another brother, and other brothers lived close by. So I had all these relatives, and then I had all the extended relatives. So no matter how many generations they were removed, we just called them aunt or uncle or cousin. But I just interviewed during the 3 months I was back there during this term I took off from school. I just talked to everybody I could, gathering all the information I could. And then I kept at it once I returned to school. And maybe within a year and a half or two, Roots came out. Roots came to TV. And I thought, that's what I'm doing. But I'm doing it before Roots came out. But I gathered up all this information and all the photographs I could in the house that had been my maternal, my Nana's childhood home. That house was filled with what people lovingly call antique furniture now, but it was filled with all of these chests and trunks that were filled with photographs, daguerreotypes, tintypes, all these old photographs, and none of them had any names on them.
Of course not. No.
So I loaded a sampling of maybe 100 to 200 photographs into another suitcase and would take them around to all these old relatives, seeing if anybody could identify any of them. And they couldn't. It was such a tragic loss. Oh, such a tragic loss.
Oh, Lisa, that is so amazing. Well, I think our family had that same disease because there's volumes of photographs with nothing written
Hmm.
on the back, which is like, oh, come on, please. I guess they thought they were going to be around forever, to say, oh, well, that's old Uncle so and so. Um,
Exactly.
if you hadn't at age 17 taken an interest like you did at
Hmm.
that exact moment,
It would have been lost.
you might get somebody who can get some stuff online, but there's nothing like I like to refer to it as boots on the ground genealogy, where you
Yes.
actually have the stuff right in front of you and you have to do the work, whether you got to trudge to the Hall of Records or archives or dig
Hmm.
through attics or
Hmm.
suitcases or whatever. That's the real old-fashioned genealogy, which is,
Yes.
hey, it's great the tools we have now online, believe me, but sometimes,
Yes.
hey, that stuff up in your attic is not online. You had to get to it. But I do want to move on to your book because
Hmm.
it's such an amazing book and an amazing story. But I'm
If I
gonna,
might add
yeah, please do.
one, okay, in the education, what led and further supported my interest in history and was so important to how this book transpired was when I went to school at Cal Poly, my very first class, my very first day, 7 o'clock in the morning, was a 400 level history class with an amazing professor named Dr. Daniel Krieger.
Oh,
He was a walking history book, a compendium of history books. He talked the entire hour, each and every day, without ever looking at a note. He was like listening to the audio of a documentary as he filled up two sides of his large rectangular classroom with names and of places and people. And you were expected to know every single thing that he wrote on that board for his tests. He was an amazing instructor, so inspiring that even though history wasn't my major, I took almost every class he taught because he was just incredible and inspirational.
I would imagine as a teacher, what better thing could you ever hear is that somebody, say 40, 30, 40 years later, remembers your class and you as somebody who inspired them to pursue a passion, whether it be your occupation, your vocation, whatever, or
Hmm.
just a passion and a love for something that means a lot to you and that you want to share with others. So
Yes.
that's wonderful. A shout out to I have some professors like that as well. To this day, I remember. But so you are someone who loves writing and writes very well. The book that you've written, The Spoon, the story of two families' survival of the Hungarian Revolution. The book is tremendous.
Thank
The
you.
language that you use, so descriptive, it brings you to where the events are happening, from the people it interacts with to the flora and fauna to the sounds and smells of the setting of this book. Beautiful writing. But let's talk about the stage that is set, where this story is told, in what era. And it really focuses around the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. So, can you give us a brief summary of exactly what that revolution was? What was it about?
Well, it had not been fomenting amongst the populace. They had no intention of having or creating a revolution. At that time, in October of 1956, there had been events transpiring in Poland where primarily the student and working populations were agitating, not for a revolution there either. They simply wanted to have a more dignified life with more rights. This area of the world, the Eastern Bloc, the Iron Curtain, created post-World War II, the peoples of these countries in the agreements made post-World War II had included that these countries would have some autonomy, that they would be able to maintain their national symbols and such. And keep in mind, too, that these countries were all basically agrarian, but they now had forced industrialization for which there was no infrastructure, no trained workforce, and no trained management either. And so the economies were in a shambles. In Hungary, it took 3 months' salary to be able to afford an overcoat in a country that gets bitterly cold. So the people were poor. They had been an agrarian society, like I said. They also had an element of an urban society. And Hungarians, they were very aware of their situation. And all they wanted was to have a little more dignified life. They weren't looking to separate. They weren't looking to fight an oppressor. They just wanted to have a more dignified life. And more in keeping with solidarity with their fellow Polish students, the students of the Technical University in Budapest and the I maul Hungarian words. I just don't have the ability to form my mouth in this way. But the Szeged University, in solidarity with those students, these students of Hungary were conspiring to have a protest, just a student protest, to ask for similar rights. And they met a moment that focused their attention on this purpose was a meeting at the Technical University. The main room there is called the Aula, A-U-L-A, Aula. And there was about 2,000 students, and there were dramatic events at this meeting. Now, keep in mind, there was about 2,000 students at this university. And the next day, when they had their student march, it swelled to 200,000 people within hours.
Wow.
And there ensued, at the end of this march, at the end of this gathering, there ensued a single shot, and thus began the Hungarian Revolution. And while this story is also a historical account of this time, it's also a story. It's a human story. It's a tragic story. It's a love story. It's a story of immigration. It's a story of the fight of freedom. And it includes those two factions that existed, or those two populations that existed at that time, the rural population and the urban population. And so there's two protagonists.
So the government that was in charge in Hungary at the time, more or less a puppet government of the Soviet Union, would you say?
Yes, yes. The man in charge was a man named Hero, G-E-R-O. And one of the 17 points the students had was that he be replaced by a man named Nagy. And Nagy was, again, he was a Stalinist. You know, like I said, the students weren't looking to overthrow the government. They just wanted a more dignified life, and they wanted to have the promises made post-World War II, which included some autonomy and the keeping of their national symbols. You know, and it's an important point to make that by these students even meeting, they were risking their lives. By speaking up, they were literally risking their lives. The prisons were overflowing, you know, with political prisoners. So at first, Moscow allowed, I mean, they didn't really know what to do. They'd never been faced with such things. So they allowed the meeting to continue. The officers, the puppet regime at that time in Hungary didn't really, as I said, know what to do. So they let the meeting go on, and then they let this protest happen. And the people of Hungary, the older people, they couldn't believe it, because nothing like this had happened, you know, since, you know, Russia had taken over their country, or in effect been given their country. And so it was a remarkable moment. It was a moment of such bravery.
Definitely. There's so much within the stories in the book about these families. As you said, both
Mhm.
the people from the countryside and the people from the city. But
Mhm.
what I noticed when you are, first of all, it was very helpful in the book. You give a sort of a key as to the families and the names of the people involved in the story and who they were. And I found myself referring back to that a few times to get everything straight. But I was able to really appreciate the characters because you would often really go back and give a little prehistory for the family to understand what they'd already been through.
Yes, yeah.
Because just reading your book, you get a full understanding of what these people had been through already with the Nazi occupied when the Nazis occupied the area and how brutal
Yes.
that was, and then the Russians, the Soviets come in, and then they're in charge. And so, then there's political prisoners being taken and how families have to deal with the loss of a loved one. So there's a lot of history. It wasn't like everything was just fine until this happened. There was a lot of oppression, a lot of fear, families that were forced to, they
Torn apart.
were
Hmm.
torn apart and forced to give their livestock away, all those things that, they counted on, for their income, for their livelihoods, and people having to move and all those things. So your book really does a beautiful job of digging into the people who are involved. Now, I love history like you do, and you can read about a historic event, but ultimately it's about the people and the stories underneath. And you
Exactly.
do a really good job of talking about, and again, city people have different backgrounds and things that happen to them from the country people, the Jewish people who in the story who had
Yes.
been persecuted as well by the Nazis, and then you're getting all those backgrounds together. So the fact that what I want to ask you now is, why did you choose the Hungarian Revolution to write your first novel?
I didn't choose it. I recently heard two interviews, one with John Denver and one with Paul Simon, and they both refer to how, or to those moments when they have been given a song. And I was given this story.
How so?
I was on a plane, and across the aisle from me was a young couple, similar vintage as myself at the time. We both had our firstborn in our arms. And so I struck up a conversation with them because I don't usually know a stranger. I delve right in from the start, asking many questions because I have found people very interesting, in part due to that first experience when I was 5. And subsequently, having made a friend of this little family, they did not live close to me, but I traveled to see them, not with great frequency because all of our lives are busy, but I would. And one of those occasions was post-Christmas, just a year or two after I'd met them. And in recounting the events of the holidays, where we had spent them and with whom and what we did, one of them, and they wish to remain anonymous, so I can't use their names.
Of course.
Many of their family members still live in Hungary, and current events certainly, make it understandable that they want their anonymity. Because after all, what happened in Hungary in October of 1956, and with the corresponding crisis in the Middle East at that time it was the Suez Canal, the same thing is now happening with Ukraine and the Middle Eastern crisis going on. So in any case, one of them mentioned to the other, don't forget the spoon. And that immediately piqued my interest. I said, what do you mean? And one thing I have found is that many people are very reticent to talk about themselves. And this was certainly the case because it took me 40 years to get the rest of the story out of him. And even still, after writing this story, he gave me another little piece of the story, which I so wish I had had to include in the book. But in any case, they briefly told me the import of this little sterling silver spoon. And immediately in my mind, I had a mental images of this epic movie like Dr. Zhivago, only this is the Hungarian Revolution, this story that he's just giving me snippets of expanded to this full screen in my head. And I knew it had to be written, but first I needed more information. And through the ensuing years in speaking with them in person, every once in a while I would dare to call on the phone, but he was such a busy man, an amazing intellect. And he would give me at most a few minutes of time and then say, "That's enough, Lisa." So I would do more research on my own, but it would inspire more questions. And I really wanted their story. And so it took a while, but I finally had enough information that I could tape all the pages of collected information all across the ceilings and walls of my studio and start the story.
Yeah, while I was reading it, I was also watching some YouTubes about the Hungarian Revolution, and
Yes,
I was I was noticing how you really followed the history so well from what I was
thank you.
hearing, and you dove into it far more than certainly I did, but you had to do a lot of work, a lot of research on top of interviewing some of the people involved. You also, I would imagine, did a lot of your own research on the Hungarian Revolution. What was that like?
Well, certain aspects of it were very difficult. Once the United States finally got on board, realizing they had made such a mistake by not helping, and they intimated they were going to help. Dulles was the Secretary of State at the time, and both the United States and England and even Radio Vatican, they were all encouraging the Hungarians with messages that intimated that there was help that was going to be coming. And no one came. No one. It's tragic. I mean, just think of those words. No one came.
No one came, and
No one came. So back to your
yeah,
question.
yeah,
So one aspect of the story was how the United States did finally step up to help the refugees. And that was a two-phase operation, Operation Mercy and Operation Safe Haven. One was by air, one was by sea. And trying to find that information, that wasn't just diving deep, that was pulling back layers, that did not want to be opened. It's surprising that something that was such an incredible effort, it was so difficult. I really wanted the names of the four ships, and who captained them. And it took a while to find some of these answers, but it was all very interesting. Other answers came from, through other friends, I found other Hungarian refugees and talked to them. And there's a wonderful site on the internet called 56. And it's 56 stories of people who survived this 56 revolution. So I gathered more personal stories. There were a few books. Some of those stories, like the Firth family, that woman who shared her story and gave me her book, she is completely willing to have her name out there. She's still a strong patriot. She's now a New Englander, but she wants the story known as much as I do and anybody else. So I just gathered information, personal stories, stories that I found on the internet, and then of course a lot of diving deep through the internet, but finding credible sources. There's Angelina Jolie was part of a refugee organization for many years, and the stories gathered from those papers were also integral to the story I put together.
yeah. I could only imagine the time you mentioned about having stuff pinned up on the wall and
Oh
everything like
yes,
that, almost like you're solving a crime. Because
yes.
one of those courses I took in college, I was a history major in college, and I took one of the mandatory courses for majors was historical inquiry. And it was
Oh,
one of my
interesting.
favorite classes. And you would have those things where you almost had to pin things up to look for clues and things like that. So I
Yes.
think that's very intriguing. Of course, you already had that natural background, like what you did with piecing together your family history, and now you're doing it
Yes.
and you're learning about the revolution. I did want to say one thing about the revolution was, from what I understand, so it started off that, look, our Polish brethren are looking for a better life. That's all we're
Yes.
trying to do. Then
Hmm.
all of a sudden it got bigger. It turns out there's a lot of people who felt they needed a better life. And then
Yes.
it erupted. It
Hmm.
almost sounds like the Boston Massacre, some shots ring
Yes.
out, and next thing you know, it's like mayhem. So
Very
that
similar.
happens. And then now there's a lot of people involved. I understand it was a relatively small Soviet presence that got they had to give up. The crowds were too overwhelming. It looked like the protesters or the freedom fighters or whatever you want to call them seemed to be winning at the time, for a
There
brief
was that
period.
moment. There
Hmm.
was that moment, and you're right. They were referred to as the freedom fighters, and integral to their effort were the Budapest boys. These were the young boys, young, not teenagers. I mean, yes, they were also teenagers, but there were boys of 7, 8 years old out there throwing Molotov cocktails. The freedom fighters. Yeah, it's just an incredible story. So, I lost your question.
No, that's okay. No, I'm just sort of saying that it looked like the freedom fighters were actually
Yes.
winning. And it made me think of
Yes.
the movie Les Mis.
Yes.
Where it was I guess in the 1830s, there was an attempt at a revolution and in France, and the the people who are resisting or who are
Hmm.
starting the revolution, they thought more people were going to join, and they never
Yes.
did, and they got annihilated. But it seemed with the Hungarian Revolution, it seemed to get bigger and bigger and bigger. But then, of course, Moscow came back with full force army.
That was a critical moment, but it was not just because Moscow changed their mind. So Khrushchev was the leader at that time.
Okay.
And then you have Chairman Mao. And it was basically Chairman Mao whispering in Khrushchev's ear. So what had transpired was you have this protest that became a revolution when a student was shot. And this revolution is relatively short-lived because there's not a large Soviet presence, and Moscow didn't respond with a stronger Soviet presence. Like there were no they didn't send any planes. They sent some tanks. That was devastating to Budapest, but the people of Hungary just kept believing that help was coming, and they just kept fighting, thinking help was coming, help was coming,
Mm.
and they kept at it, and they won the day, and the world couldn't believe it, and Moscow was willing to let them have their 17 points. It looked like they had won. The
Mm.
people, leaders of the world, couldn't believe it. It was an amazing day. But then Chairman Mao said, you know, if you let this go unchecked, it could threaten the whole Eastern Bloc. And so, without any communication to that effect, Khrushchev sent tanks and troops to the borders and invited Naj, because Naj was appointed to replace Hero, Naj and Pal Malater, who was a key military individual, and other people, and invited them all to this meeting to talk about how things were going to go. But it was all a ruse.
Mm.
And so the second phase, the second, even more bloody and just so traumatic and devastating, the second phase began. And it was just like the first moment when the tanks arrived. The second onslaught was even more of a surprise because they had no idea. They thought their lives were going to begin to be better
Mm.
and have a different working relationship with Moscow. And instead, they were devastated.
They were crushed, and then of
They
course
were just crushed.
it creates a refugee situation, which
Hmm.
get into in the story and how it affected the families and the characters in your book.
Hmm.
So, having written a really challenging historical fiction, uh,
Thank you. It was.
how did writing this book change you in any way, Lisa?
um, I don't know that it changed me because I've always had a great deal of empathy. I still cry at Bambi, so
I do too.
these, these, again, these stories of human endurance and courage, it's so moving.
Mm.
I respect these people so much. And so many of these people don't even think they have a story to tell. And they're just walking monuments. They're walking heroes. It's like, do you know who you're in the room with? Do you know what this person has lived through? What they did? You know? So I granted, like so many people who've read my book, people who are otherwise think of themselves as being well educated, there's a similar storyline to their review of my book, which is we had no idea this happened.
Yeah.
You know, this event in history is so unknown. And that's why, I that's one of the reasons why I felt the story just really needed to be written, but more so that that movie needs to happen. That's how I saw it.
I said that to
This,
Kelly. I said that to my wife, Kelly, that this needs to be a movie because you really get that sense of there's a lot of World War II docudrama type of things that are out now. There's
mhm,
a big focus on that and how
mhm,
individual people were affected by
mhm,
the war. But this is something, 1956, 11 years after the end of World War II.
mhm.
But you get an idea how these people, individuals, are impacted. And these are the same people who, many of them who were impacted by World War II and all the things that we talked about before happened to them. But I think um, what's so, I guess I mentioned this to you before when we were talking. When I was a little kid, my parents bought this album, and part of it was music from bygone era, but part of it was old radio broadcasts. And
Mhm.
one of them was FDR's funeral being reported. Another one was the plane that hit the Empire State Building back in the 1940s, the small plane that hit. And then it ended with the JFK assassination. But in,
Wow.
and I knew about all those things, but in between all those, there was this voice, if I remember this correctly, it was a voice crying out from Hungary, to come help us. Basically getting crushed here. And I remember asking my parents what it sounded so sad and so desperate. Did anybody ever go to help them? And they
No
said
one,
no. They said no,
no
they
one.
didn't. They got stamped out, basically.
Radio Budapest went silent with the last transmission. Help. No
Mm,
one came.
nobody came.
No one came.
Mm. That's so sad. But I
It's
again,
heartbreaking. It's difficult to say the words without just crying.
nobody helped them. But what I got from the book was a sense of family, determination, courage, standing up for what you believe are some of the things that came out of this.
And the history and the courage that followed these people. I
Yeah.
mean, there they are on the Danube in the student protest walking along the Danube, right there where the Arrow Cross murdered so many people. An art installation, a memorial art installation was put there, the shoes,
Mm.
because they were to take off their shoes and then they were shot. It was done by the Arrow Cross, a lot of Jewish people, a lot of Jewish people. And
Mm.
so the complicated, tragic story that endured for decades in this area. And that's the fate of this area, that is between Western Europe and Russia, these countries that just get overrun again and again and again, as Ukraine is now being overrun or attempted to be overrun. And these brave people standing up, fighting for their country. And so it was there in Hungary, these brave people who had been endured so much for so long.
Well, I want to ask you, this is like a real hypothetical situation. I know that it's a novel,
Yes.
historical fiction, which is
Hmm.
it's a really uh, can be complex because you got to be accurate as much as you can to the history,
Hmm. Hmm.
but you have to be able to fill in with your own imagination some of the characters and some of the other events, and you've got to be true to both, which is really complicated.
Yes.
Um,
And not give away the identities of the
and
people.
not give away the
That's
identity, which is
complicated.
very important. But if you could enter this novel and go back
Hmm.
to those characters there, two questions.
Hmm.
One is, who would you want to speak with? And is there something you would want to ask them?
Good question. They're all amazing people in their own right. Every story, because every story is based on fact in this book. But I think I would choose the female protagonist's father, who in English you'd say George. His name's George, Gyorgy. And I would choose him because, first of all, he's an amazing, courageous person, as they all are. But his life transcended World War II and now this incident. And so, and he had this amazing life that, like so many American stories, had been just created out of his own intellect and hard work. His is a story of loss, of endurance, of being the patriarch, saving his family. I'd want to talk to him. And I think I would ask him what his greatest fear had been, because he had to make so many choices for the sake of his family that had to have been so difficult, and weighing the complicated implications of those choices. He'd been a hero of World War II. So I mean, his story was so complicated, interesting, dramatic, courageous. Just what a man. What a human being. And then his last decision, because his last decision separated him from his family for the rest of their lives.
Oh, wow.
What a story of love.
Well, thank you for recording this story for the rest of us to enjoy. And in reading it, some of the scenes that you set, particularly, in the beginning with there's a Christmas Eve thing, it paints a picture with words of something that brought back memories of myself with my extended family and people telling
Hmm.
stories around the dinner table and stuff. And
Hmm.
I think from what I understand from your story, it reminds you of, being at your grandparents' house and hearing stories about,
Exactly.
and then even being back in California and having those World War II era people sort of feeding stories into you and
Hmm.
things like that. So, boy, it's a great book because you're going to learn a lot about unfortunately, little known, perhaps in the United States, of really what happened. It's a long time ago. It's almost 68. It's 68 years ago almost. So you can learn about it, but also there's such great character development and beautiful writing. So I highly recommend it. So
Thank you.
do you have another project in your mind right now?
I have had stories brewing, waiting to be written for many years. Those letter writings I did starting at the age of 5.
Mhm.
My older relatives through the years have been encouraging me to write, and I just, you know, didn't get around to it. Who would want to read it? But then people kept saying, I'll read it. You know,
Oh,
they just
definitely.
kept encouraging me. So yes, there's several projects. Several involve people I've met. There's an amazing woman that was as much a grandmother to my children as their actual grandmothers. Actually, more so. She was an amazing woman. And her life of endurance and remaining this loving person despite everything that happened to her. She was sold by her parents 3 times as a child to older
Oh,
men.
oh gosh, that's
It's an
horrible.
incredible story. It's incredible. That story's up there. It's getting to be kind of a norm, these death and dying stories, but I have had the honor of being with people when they've passed away, and that process, what families go through, the completely unexpected, mostly because people don't want to talk about it, and it needs to be talked about. There's that story. There's the story of all those summers in New England with all those relatives, which is like a modern Anne of Green Gables story. I tell these stories and people are like, you have to write that. You have to write that. So there's that story. There's a ghost story involving New England that I really want to write. So there's a lot of stories.
Can't wait to hear about your next book. I know that The Spoon has won some awards.
Yes, the book won the NIEA award, the National Independent Excellence Award. And last weekend was the CBAs, the Chanticleer International Book Award. And The Spoon made it through the semifinals and finals, and then won in the late historical fiction category. And it was an amazing moment. I actually came out of one of my shoes. I stood up so fast. They're like, Lisa, go up. I said, I have to put my shoes back on. Just a minute.
You came out of your shoes? Well, you only came out of one shoe. You got to come out of the other shoe next, right? For the next award?
Right.
Well, I want to congratulate you on those honors and for the hard work that you did on The Spoon. And I really wish you the very best and hope to be
Thank you, James.
keeping in touch so we can speak to you again about your next project. But people like you keep history alive and you preserve it. And mostly stories, like the real people who were involved in history. So what's the best way for people to learn more about you and get a hold of a copy of your book, The Spoon?
Well, thank you for asking. I do have a website that I am not great at keeping up on, but lisavoelker.com. And you can find lots of photographs of the Hungarian Revolution and Hungary there. And I'm on Facebook. I can be emailed at tintype5056 at gmail.com. The book is available for bookstores through and people, but through Ingram Spark, and it's also on Amazon. And I think the best way to learn history is through the personal stories, as Dr. Krieger did for me. I mean, it was such a lesson because reading the nuts and bolts is just so dry, but reading personal stories, it just makes history live.
It does.
And it's so important.
Yeah, and you've done that. And we're going to also, in our show notes, we will put your website.
Thank you.
And that, of course, any other links so that people can get a hold of your book and learn more about you, and hopefully keep in touch so that they can find out about any future books that you're going to come out with. But keep doing what you're doing, Lisa.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. And I hope
you're a busy man, but if you ever have time to read it, I hope you enjoy it.
Oh, no. Well, I have been reading it. It's been, the book is fantastic. And as I'm going, it's piquing my interest step by step at the different, as the revolution rolled out. And I kept going to learn more about it. I want to learn some more about it. And I'm finding, wow, Lisa did a lot of research for this. It's like you're like right on from the other things that I was going along and learning more about it. And now I got to find out more about the Hungarian Revolution, because, as you said, I think it's very appropriate to some of the things that are going on now. Well, Lisa, thanks again. And I really appreciate this. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you so much. Have a lovely day. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Your History, Your Story. You can connect with us on Facebook and YouTube at Your History, Your Story, or on Instagram and Twitter at yhys podcast. We'd love to hear from you if you have any questions, comments, or a story to tell. Be well and God bless.